July 24, 1943, approximately 120 miles west of Truk Lagoon, Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Randall Daspit peered through a slightly fogged periscope lens and observed an event that would upend every belief the United States Navy held about its principal weapon. A massive 1926-2-ton Japanese tanker, adrift and defenseless after being hit by 2 torpedoes from Daspit's submarine, now presented the ideal target for a decisive third strike at point-blank range at a 90-degree angle. This maneuver represented the pinnacle of submarine warfare tactics. However, what transpired over the following hour would reveal an egregious failure within the American military apparatus. The torpedoes being used were defective, functioning correctly less than 1/5 of the time. For nearly 18 months during the Pacific War, U.S. Navy submariners had been engaged with faulty weapons. Their efforts often went unrewarded, while Japanese convoys sailed unimpeded. Those tasked with addressing the issue had unjustly blamed the sailors for their predicament. On that particular day, one submarine commander would compile evidence of such magnitude and clarity that even the most entrenched naval bureaucracy could no longer overlook the facts. The Mark 14 torpedo, touted as America's cutting-edge weapon system, was fundamentally flawed, and it took one individual's relentless investigation, undertaken despite official opposition and its significant personal risk, to rectify the problem. The repercussions of this bureaucratic oversight were not merely financial but also included a toll in unsunk vessels, lost lives, and an extended conflict. The odds for victory had been recalibrated in these waters west of Truk Lagoon, with Lawrence Daspit about to furnish proof that would alter the course of history. One 1941, shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when Admiral Chester Nimitz ordered unrestricted submarine warfare against Japanese shipping. Submarine fleet embarked upon this mission. They were convinced that they owned the world's finest torpedo, the Mark 14, crafted at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island. This remarkable piece of engineering was 20 feet 6 inches long, with a diameter of 21 inches and weighed 3,000 pounds, packed full of intricate machinery. It could travel 4,009,000 yards at a slower pace of 309,000 yards, at a slower pace of 300 knots. In 1931 dollars, each torpedo cost 10 parian, equivalent to about $195 today, more than the price of 15 new cars. Given its value and sophistication, it was clear that such weaponry should not be squandered on mere testing. A single hit had the potential to sink an entire battleship. However, despite initial optimism, only 2 live-fire tests were carried out on May 26, 1926. The first test was a complete failure. The torpedo passed beneath its target without detonating. In contrast, the second test succeeded in deliberately sinking the decommissioned submarine USS Late, which had been designated for this specific purpose. From that day forward until December 1941, over 17 years elapsed with no further live-fire tests due to the prohibitive cost of torpedoes and budget constraints imposed by the Great Depression. Military spending had suffered significant cuts throughout the 1930s as Congress continued to slash Navy funding. The Naval Torpedo Station in Newport operated around the clock, employing 3,000 workers across 3 shifts, but managed to produce only 1.5 torpedoes daily. Torpedo production was so sluggish that shortages emerged even before the war began. By January 1938, there were 29 million worth of unfilled orders. As a result, they tested the Mark 14 with lightweight practice heads designed to float when depleted of fuel. These practice heads were retrieved, examined, and deemed flawless. The magnetic exploder was put through its paces in still water tanks within laboratories, yielding perfect results. Consequently, the Bureau of Ordnance declared the Mark 14 combat ready. However, weapons developed under laboratory conditions using dummy warheads do not always perform as expected during actual combat situations. On December 24, 1941, just 16 days into the war, Commander Tyrell Dwight Jacobs, aboard USS Sargo, launched 8 torpedoes at 2 Japanese merchant ships. Despite his meticulous fire control solution and a pursuit lasting 55 minutes to ensure precise calculations, all 8 torpedoes failed to hit or explode their targets. A week earlier, on December 14th, USS Seawolf reported that its torpedoes were running significantly deeper than set. The commanding officer estimated the torpedoes passed about 10 to 15 feet below intended marks, rendering them ineffective for both magnetic detonation and direct contact hits. Reports of similar issues proliferated rapidly. For instance, just 1 week after Pearl Harbor, USS Sargo documented a premature explosion midway through its run towards a target. USS Skipjack, USS Stingray, and USS Sturgeon all reported identical issues from their patrol zones. The torpedoes were malfunctioning, or simply did not explode at all. In some cases, they even circled back towards the launching submarines. Astonishingly, 80% of these torpedoes failed to perform as intended, missing targets, malfunctioning, or failing to detonate. The statistics were grim. For every 10 torpedoes launched at the enemy, only 2 managed to hit and explode properly. This failure rate was catastrophic, considering that American submarines should have been decimating the Japanese merchant fleet. Instead, Japanese convoys sailed relatively undisturbed while American submariners faced life-threatening risks due to unreliable weaponry. They submitted detailed reports to their superiors and meticulously documented every attack, malfunction, and failure. They also requested thorough investigations and testing. However, the Bureau of Ordnance responded consistently and dismissively. They claimed the issue lay not with the weapons, but with the submarine commanders themselves. Their approaches were subpar. Over 2 decades of engineering expertise contributed to its development. There was no conceivable way that the issue could stem from the weapon itself. Rather, it must be attributed to those operating it. Rear Admiral Thomas Withers, Commander Submarines Pacific at Pearl Harbor, frequently aligned with the Bureau of Ordnance on this matter. Whenever submarine commanders reported torpedo malfunctions, Withers would attribute their complaints to a lack of initiative among the crews. Given the scarcity and high cost of these torpedoes, they could not afford excessive testing in the field. Bohr had certified the weapons as reliable, effectively concluding any further debate. However, Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood was attentive to the concerns raised by submarine commanders. Born on May 6, 1890 in Midland, Virginia, Lockwood graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1912. His submarine career commenced in September 1914 when he joined USS Mohegan for training. By December 1, 1914, he was commanding USS A2, which at that time was the Navy's 2nd submarine. In May 1942, he assumed command of submarines in the Southwest Pacific area from his base in Fremantle, Australia. Almost immediately, he faced the Mark 14 torpedo controversy. His subordinates were documenting alarmingly high failure rates. Japanese vessels were slipping away, while American subs struggled to make any significant impact, despite taking tremendous risks. Lockwood was aware that BARD would not approve formal testing due to the cost and scarcity of torpedoes. However, he recognized that deploying men with faulty weapons could be far more costly than conducting tests. In June 1942, Lockwood took an unprecedented step by ordering unauthorized trials of the Mark 14 torpedo in defiance of Bureau of Ordnance regulations. Despite risking his career, he sought to determine whether the torpedoes indeed ran too deep. With assistance from Captain James Fee, Lockwood's chief of staff, a straightforward test was devised. They would fire torpedoes through fishing nets suspended at specific depths in Frenchman Bay near Albany, Australia. On June 20, 1942, USS Skipjack launched a single torpedo with an exercise warhead from 85 Vivid yards. Set to run at a depth of 10 feet, the torpedo should have penetrated the net at that mark, but instead tore through it at 25 feet, indicating a discrepancy of 15 feet deeper than intended. The following day, James F. oversaw 2 additional test firings. Both torpedoes dove 11 feet below their intended depth settings. This evidence was unequivocal. The Mark 114 torpedo exhibited dangerous depth instability. Lockwood promptly reported his findings to the Bureau of Ordnance. However, the Bureau's response was swift and dismissive, claiming that no reliable conclusions could be drawn from Lockwood's tests due to a lack of scientific validity in the fishing net method. They suggested that submarine commanders might have adjusted the torpedoes incorrectly. Undeterred, Lockwood repeated his tests with 3 torpedoes set at 10 feet, only to find them cutting the net at 21 feet, still 11 feet deeper than intended. Despite these results, the Bureau of Ordnance continued to reject the evidence presented by Lockwood and instead pointed to their own successful trials in Newport, where no depth issues were observed. Admiral Ernest Joseph King, Chief of Naval Operations, had grown impatient with the bureaucratic delays. Recognizing that such nonsense was unacceptable, he issued an order for the Bureau of Ordnance to conduct its own tests immediately. In August 1942, more than 8 months into the war, the Bureau of Ordnance officially acknowledged that the Mark 14 ran 11 feet deeper than set due to a series of design flaws. During the development phase, the torpedoes underwent trials with lightweight practice warheads. Warheads weighing 60–80 pounds of explosives, the torpedoes naturally dove to greater depths. At speeds reaching 46 knots, the flow around this conical shape caused a low-pressure zone that misled the pressure sensor into believing it was operating at shallower depths than actual conditions, prompting the torpedo to dive deeper. As the torpedo's velocity increased, so did its diving tendency. By August 1942, the depth problem was recognized. The Bureau of Ordnance issued revised instructions for calibrating the depth mechanism, and submarine commanders began setting their torpedoes to run at 0 depth to correct 11-foot error in targeting. The Navy assumed this resolved the issue. However, when the torpedoes were set to run at the intended depths, another problem arose: premature explosions. These detonations occurred hundreds of yards short of Japanese targets, causing submarine commanders to witness through their periscopes as the torpedoes exploded harmlessly in open water. The magnetic exploder was prematurely activating. On April 9, 1943, Lieutenant Commander John A. Scott aboard the USS Tunney found himself in an ideal attacking position with 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, Hyo, Juno, and Taiyo, all within a mere 888 yards of his submarine. Further investigation by intelligence analysts later uncovered that each of the 7 torpedoes had detonated prematurely due to an early activation of their magnetic exploders. Not a single torpedo reached its intended target. The carrier sustained no damage from this attack either. A third incident occurred on June 10, 1943, when USS Trigger fired a volley of 6 torpedoes at the Japanese aircraft carrier HEO from a distance of approximately 2,000 yards. 1 torpedo missed entirely, 1 detonated prematurely, and another failed to explode altogether. Only 2 successfully hit their mark, but caused only minor damage to the carrier, which managed to limp back to port undeterred. The repeated pattern of premature explosions clearly indicated a significant issue with the torpedo's reliability during this period. The magnetic exploder proved to be an unreliable device. On April 27, 1943, the Bureau of Ordnance officially acknowledged that the Mark 6 exploder was prone to premature detonations at shallow depths. The Bureau suggested disconnecting the magnetic function and opting for contact shots instead, but even this recommendation came with stipulations. They proposed extending the arming distance from 450 yards to 700 yards and set stringent conditions under which submarine commanders should fire their torpedoes in order to reduce the risk of premature explosions. Admiral King rejected the increased arming distance, deeming it unacceptable, as submarines needed to be closer to their targets. He concurred with Lockwood's stance that the magnetic exploder should be disabled entirely, On June 24, 1943, Admiral Chester Nimitz issued an order for all submarines in the Pacific Fleet to deactivate the magnetic influence exploder and use only the contact exploder. It took 18 months into the war before the Navy admitted that the magnetic exploder was a failure. The issues with the weapon had been inherent from its conception by the Bureau of Ordnance. So secretive were these devices that even submarine commanders were barred from inspecting them. According to Bureau regulations, torpedo shops had to apply paint dots on the screws securing the exploder mechanism. Any tampering would disrupt this precise coloring. Submarine skippers were literally forbidden from examining the very weapons they risked their lives with. However, submariners are known for their ingenuity and resourcefulness. Upon learning it was blue, they would procure matching cans of blue paint and proceed to open up the exploder mechanisms, make necessary adjustments, and meticulously repaint the screw heads to avoid detection. When torpedoes were returned to official storage facilities, there was no indication of tampering. By mid-1943, submarine commanders throughout the Pacific began discreetly disabling the magnetic exploder on their vessels. They falsified patrol reports by exaggerating the size of enemy ships to justify using more torpedoes. They lied to their superiors because the alternative was dying without achieving any significant results. Only one area commander insisted that his submarines continue employing the magnetic exploder, Rear Admiral Ralph Waldo Christie, who commanded submarines in the Southwest Pacific area. Christie had been responsible for developing the Mark VI magnetic exploder during the 1920s and 1930s. He had devoted years to perfecting it and had built his reputation on its success. Despite mounting evidence of failures, Christie refused to acknowledge any flaws in his creation. He ordered his submarines to keep using the magnetic exploder regardless of the mounting issues. His submarine commanders were frustrated by this decision. They observed their torpedoes detonating prematurely or failing completely, while submarines under Lockwood's command, which operated without the magnetic feature, began experiencing more success. Christie's boats continued suffering from high failure rates as Lockwood's achieved significant results in sinking Japanese ships. It took a direct order from Admiral Thomas Kincaid, Commander Allied Naval Forces, Southwest Pacific Area, issued in November 1943, to compel Christie to disable the magnetic exploder in his area. Even after addressing the depth issue and disabling the magnetic exploder, torpedoes still malfunctioned frequently. Submarine commanders now reported a third problem, duds or torpedoes that struck Japanese ships but failed to explode. On July 24, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit aboard USS Tenosa encountered an ideal target every submarine commander dreamed of finding, a 19,262-ton tanker. This ship was unescorted and alone, with codebreakers having already provided advanced warning about its route. Daspit noticed Tonin Maru No. 3 heading straight towards him. His son heard the distinct thumps as each torpedo hit the tanker's hull, but only 2 detonated. The explosion struck the engine room, causing the ship to stop and list heavily to port. Daspit then moved in for a final assault. With the tanker motionless, Daspit had ample time to prepare his attack meticulously. He maneuvered Tenosa to within 87.5 yards of the target, positioning it at a perfect 90-degree angle, which is the ideal firing position every submarine commander aims for during training. It tracked directly towards its mark. The crew watched as the wake of the torpedo sliced through the water like a lethal white line heading toward the target. Upon impact with the hull, there was a dull thud but no explosion. Daspit found it hard to believe what he saw. He then fired his 6th and final torpedo. It hit its mark, yet again without exploding. Torpedo number 8 also hit without detonating. Daspit summoned his torpedo officer to the conning tower, where they inspected the remaining torpedoes in the tubes. The equipment appeared to be in perfect condition. The torpedoes were well maintained, their depth settings accurate, and the contact exploders properly armed. There was no apparent mechanical cause for the malfunction. In his patrol report, Daspit detailed how one of these torpedoes hit the tanker on the port side and created a splash near the ship's edge. It was then observed to veer off course to the right and leap out of the water approximately 100 feet from the tanker's stern. It is difficult for me to convince myself that what I witnessed actually occurred. By then, a Japanese destroyer had appeared and started laying depth charges. Daspit was forced to depart, but before diving deep to avoid detection by the destroyer. Torpedo number 12 struck its target but failed to explode. Torpedo number 13 hit as well but did not detonate. Similarly, torpedo numbers 14 and 15 both made contact without exploding. Out of 15 torpedoes fired, 11 confirmed hits were recorded from optimal range and angle, yet only 2 resulted in explosions. With 1 torpedo still on board, Daspit decided to make a choice that would alter naval history. He opted to conserve the remaining torpedo for analysis back at Pearl Harbor, rather than expending it on a target against which torpedoes seemed ineffective. Subsequently, he set a course for Pearl Harbor and documented in his log an outcome no submarine commander desires to report, returning with an empty magazine. The USS Teninosa arrived at Pearl Harbor on August 4, 1943. Daspit proceeded straight to the submarine force headquarters where Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood awaited him. Having succeeded Robert English as commander of Submarines Pacific in February 1943, after English's fatal plane crash on January 21st, Lockwood anticipated an outburst from Daspit. Instead, he wrote, "I was bracing myself for a barrage of curses directed at me and the Bureau of Ordnance, Newport Torpedo Station, and Base Torpedo Shop. I would not have blamed him considering that large tankers are rare." Daspit's arrival marked a pivotal moment in the submarine warfare narrative, highlighting significant issues with naval weaponry during World War II. Dan's rage bordered on speechlessness, yet Daspit remained composed. Instead of erupting, he calmly recounted what transpired: 15 torpedoes launched, 11 confirmed hits, and 2 explosions. A clear target had escaped unharmed due to malfunctioning American torpedoes. The solitary torpedo retrieved by Teninosa was sent directly to the submarine-based torpedo facility for a meticulous examination by technicians. They concluded there were no issues. It appeared fully functional. According to all assessments, it should have detonated upon impact. Lockwood realized he couldn't rely on Bard's actions any longer. For months, they had dismissed the depth issue and denied the magnetic exploder problem for over a year. Denial would continue until irrefutable proof was presented. Thus, Lockwood decided to initiate his own investigation, once more without official approval, in contravention of regulations, and at considerable risk to his career. He directed Art Taylor, the gunnery and torpedo officer, to arrange live fire tests using actual combat torpedoes with full warheads under realistic attack conditions. Lieutenant Commander Swedson also joined this investigation, adding to the already legendary status he held within the submarine force. In 1939, he orchestrated the rescue operation that saved 33 men from the sunken USS Squola submarine. He also developed a mothership lung device, which has significantly contributed to saving numerous lives. His expertise in mechanical systems and testing was unparalleled. He recognized the dangerous flaws of the Mark 14 torpedo, which was causing fatalities among American submariners. Taylor and Mommsen meticulously examined charts of Hawaiian waters to identify an ideal test site. They sought a location with steep cliffs that plunged directly into deep water, complete with a sandy seabed for easy retrieval of torpedoes. The perfect spot was discovered off the coast of Kahului, a tiny uninhabited island southwest of Maui. On August 31, 1943, the USS Muskellunge launched 3 full warhead torpedoes at the cliffs of Kahului. 2 of them detonated upon impact, but the third failed to explode. Mommsen personally dove into the water to inspect the malfunctioning torpedo and found it shattered into 2 pieces with an open warhead. The warhead had not ignited. With utmost caution, the crew lifted the unexploded torpedo onto a barge and transported it to Pearl Harbor. Upon disassembling the exploder mechanism after removing the warhead, Mommsen and his team uncovered shocking evidence. The firing pin had been released from its lock, but did not travel far enough along the guide rails to strike the primer cap with sufficient force for detonation. The impact of hitting the cliff at 46 knots had damaged the delicate mechanism, increasing the likelihood that the faster and harder the torpedo struck, the greater the chance the firing pin would become jammed without triggering an explosion. A direct 90-degree hit, which submarine commanders aimed for during training, paradoxically resulted in the highest probability of a failed detonation. Munz couldn't validate his hypothesis by launching costly warheads against cliff faces. Instead, Lowe endorsed an alternative methodology. Art Taylor oversaw the assembly of a test apparatus. A crane was borrowed from Pearl Harbor shipyard to facilitate this experiment. Dummy warheads were filled with sand to replicate the weight of actual explosive charges. These mock warheads were then dropped from a height of 90 feet onto a steel plate, which was oriented at various angles. The drop distance of 90 feet was meticulously chosen. It ensured that upon impact, the velocity would match that of a torpedo moving at 46 knots. The outcomes were strikingly revealing when warhead struck the steel plate head. At 90 Chi, 7 out of 10 failed to detonate. In contrast, oblique impacts, where the angle was 45 degrees, yielded better results with only half failing to explode. This indicated that glancing blows were twice as dependable as perpendicular hits. The issue was apparent. The Mark VI exploder's firing pin mechanism was overly sensitive. It had been intended for use with slower torpedoes and thus was ill-suited for high-speed impacts. The Mark III exploder utilized in World War I torpedoes also experienced similar issues, where impact forces pushed the firing pin sideways within its guides, preventing it from reaching the primer properly. Previous designs attempted to address this by reinforcing the spring mechanism. However, when developing the Mark VI exploder during the 1920s, these earlier lessons went unheeded. They devised a system that was even more intricate. Mark I 14 moving at 46 knots instead of 30 produced forces too strong for the firing pin mechanism to endure. Submarine commanders had been instructed that a 90°D shot was ideal, yet this angle resulted in the highest likelihood of a malfunctioning torpedo. The Navy's training emphasized an attack method that actually increased the chance of failure. Lockwood promptly dispatched instructions to all submarines under his command: avoid firing at 90°D angles and instead aim for oblique angles, specifically 45 degrees or less. This directive was met with confusion by submarine leaders, who had been thoroughly trained otherwise. It complicated their tactics but halved the incidence of defective torpedoes. Furthermore, this order demonstrated to the Bureau of Ordnance that the issue lay not in operator error, but in faulty torpedoes. Lockwood recognized that the oblique shot directive was merely a stopgap measure. The firing pin mechanism needed urgent redesign. However, the Bureau of Ordnance held exclusive authority over torpedo modifications and was reluctant to acknowledge further design flaws. Consequently, Lockwood decided to take action himself. He directed the submarine tender USS Holland to start producing modified firing pins. This fix was both effective and ingenious. The initial Mark VI exploder featured a heavy steel firing pin block that tended to jam under high-impact conditions due to its substantial inertia. Lieutenant E.A. Johnson, working under Taylor's guidance, created a lighter version using aluminum alloy instead of the original steel. This aluminum was sourced from an unexpected place, propellers salvaged from Japanese aircraft that had been downed during the attack on Pearl Harbor. The submariners found this ironic but practical, as they were now repairing American torpedoes with materials derived from enemy planes. Also invented an electrical firing switch to serve as a substitute for the mechanical firing pin. Both innovations proved effective and were relatively straightforward to produce. On September 30, 1943, USS Barb set sail from Pearl Harbor on patrol armed with 20 improved torpedoes equipped with the newly manufactured aluminum firing pins. The results were swift and impactful. These modifications significantly enhanced the performance of the torpedoes. By mid-October, USS Holland had produced sufficient quantities of the modified firing pins to outfit all departing submarines. This marked a critical turning point nearly 2 years into the conflict, as the United States Navy finally secured reliable torpedoes. In 1942, American submarines fired 140-42 torpedoes with limited success. Post-war analysis by the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee revealed that only 1344 ships totaling 53390 tons were actually sunk or damaged, indicating a much lower actual success rate than wartime estimates had suggested. In 1944, American submarines sank 49 ships totaling 238.7 thanks to functioning torpedoes. By 1945, they had reduced this number to ships and 46,872 tons, a decline due to the scarcity of targets following their successful operations that heaved. Once the Mark 14 torpedo was repaired, it became one of the most potent weapons in the Pacific War. Throughout the conflict, American submarines sank 3,900 Japanese vessels, weighing a total of 514 million tons, and destroyed approximately 60% of Japan's merchant marine. Is significantly disrupted Japan's supply chains and led to the sinking of 8 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, and 11 cruisers. They were responsible for about 55% of all Japanese shipping losses. However, this victory came at a great personal cost. American submariners endured the highest casualty rate among all branches of the military. An astounding 22% of submariners never returned from their patrols, with 52 submarines lost in total, and over 3,000 total and over 3,500 officers and crew members perishing. Many of these casualties occurred during the war's early stages, when torpedo malfunctions were rampant. Questions about the number of submarines lost due to faulty torpedoes and the lives sacrificed in repeated attacks on targets that should have been destroyed with a single salvo plagued Lockwood throughout his life. Additionally, he often wondered how many Japanese ships managed to escape because their torpedoes malfunctioned, ultimately allowing these vessels to inflict damage upon American forces. On September 30, 1943, after torpedo issues were resolved, Lockwood declared it V-Day for submarine warfare. Later in life, he wrote, "Had the torpedoes been thoroughly tested before the war began, we would have entered combat with functioning weapons, likely shortening the conflict. Numerous lives could have been spared if different measures had been taken." The Bureau never issued an official apology for its shortcomings. In the post-war analysis, it conceded that the testing process was insufficient. They admitted that production planning had significant flaws. It was acknowledged that the torpedoes were intended for meticulous small-scale manufacturers and could not be scaled up for wartime production demands. In their final report, the Bureau stated, "Given the limited funds available during peacetime, much of the work now underway after more than a year and a half into the war should have been completed years ago. The fact that this work was delayed or ignored both before and early in the war suggests a lack of practical understanding of the issues involved, which is inconsistent with the Bureau's high standards and reflects poorly on both the Bureau of Ordnance and the Naval Torpedo Station at Newport." This was an extraordinary admission, but for many submarine personnel who perished due to faulty weapons, it came too late. The torpedo scandal exposed fundamental issues in how the Navy developed and tested its weaponry. Cost concerns frequently took precedence over operational effectiveness, while secrecy hindered those using the equipment from understanding how they functioned. Bureaucratic pride also delayed necessary fixes for problems that field commanders identified shortly after the war began. The Bureau of Ordnance spent 2 decades developing a torpedo that ultimately did not work as intended. They disregarded reports from personnel who faced life-threatening situations while using these weapons, blaming submarine commanders for incompetence rather than acknowledging design flaws. Even when issues could no longer be ignored, they resisted every attempt at fixing them, modifying, or improving the equipment. Charles Lockwood emerged as a hero not due to his engineering skills, but because he listened to and trusted his submarine commander's expertise. He risked his career by conducting unauthorized tests. When official channels failed, he circumvented bureaucratic procedures. He personally took on the task of repairing weapons that were not within his jurisdiction, and most crucially, he would not send men into battle with defective weaponry. Lockwood conducted an unauthorized investigation in Frenchman Bay in June 1942, uncovering a critical depth issue. On covering Aachen 43, at Kahula, his unapproved tests revealed problems with dud torpedoes. By September of the same year, he initiated an unsanctioned manufacturing operation aboard USS Holland that provided the necessary fix to ensure American submariners had functional torpedoes. Each action broke regulations and risked court-martial, directly challenging board's authority, one of the most influential entities within the Navy. Lockwood grasped something key that eluded the Bureau. Weapons must function effectively. Testing aims to identify flaws. Leadership's role is to address issues rather than ignore them. By war's conclusion, he had been elevated to Vice Admiral. One was present at the surrender ceremony on USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. Standing alongside other senior Allied commanders who had triumphed over Japan, his submarine forces had destroyed more Japanese shipping than any other force combined. The Mark 14 torpedo became a formidable weapon in the Pacific theater. Yet, its success was due to one man's resolve not to tolerate failure. At heart, this is a tale of testing, or rather, the consequences of inadequate testing. In 1931, a new car was priced at $700, while the Mark N torpedo cost $2,000. Due to its high expense, the Navy opted not to destroy torpedoes during tests and instead used lightweight dummy warheads for evaluations. They tested the magnetic exploder in laboratory tanks and conducted only 2 live fire trials in 1926 before deploying the weapon into combat. The consequences of inadequate testing were catastrophic, resulting in failed attacks, lost submarines, fatalities among submariners, and a prolonged conflict. By 1944, the United States was manufacturing 15 Markov 4-time torpedoes daily, with total wartime production surpassing 60,000 units. At $10 billion each in 1930 dollars, this equates to approximately $600 million or $12 billion today. Had proper testing been conducted, destroying a few dozen torpedoes in realistic scenarios, the issues with depth control, magnetic exploders, and firing pins could have been identified prior to the onset of war. The cost for such comprehensive testing would likely have been around $530, which is less than the price of a single submarine. Instead, the Navy waged war with faulty weapons for 2 years. Submarine commanders experienced success rates of about 20%, whereas they could have achieved figures closer to 80% or higher. Japanese merchant vessels that should have been sunk in 1942 continued their operations until 1944. Providing crucial supplies to Japanese forces every month they remained operational. Each soldier who received these supplies had the potential to harm American soldiers, and each aircraft fueled by those tankers could engage and shoot down U.S. pilots. The mathematics are startling. If American torpedoes had functioned correctly starting in December 1941, the submarine force could have achieved their objectives within a single year instead of 3. Japan's merchant fleet would have been eliminated by 1943, rather than 1945, potentially shortening the war significantly and saving countless lives. All this could have been accomplished for the price of adequate testing. In 1939, destroying just 50 torpedoes during realistic tests would have cost $500,000, made curable human life. They were mistaken, as not conducting these tests proved far more expensive in the long run. Today, this torpedo scandal is scrutinized at military institutions as a cautionary example. It underscores several crucial lessons. First, weapon systems must undergo rigorous testing under realistic combat conditions. Laboratory trials and simulations with dummy warheads cannot reveal performance issues that emerge during actual warfare. Second, those who will use the weaponry should be actively involved in its development and testing phases. Submarine commanders identified torpedo problems within weeks of the conflict beginning, but were excluded from the developmental process. Finally, excessive secrecy can hinder progress and prevent necessary improvements. The magnetic exploder was so highly classified that even submarine commanders were barred from examining it, thus preventing those most knowledgeable about the weapon from identifying its flaws. Fifth, true leadership involves listening, trusting expert advice, and taking calculated risks to address issues head-on. Lockwood exemplified genuine leadership by defying authority when necessary and refusing to put lives at risk with flawed equipment. By September 1943, American submarines finally had functional torpedoes. This change was swift and impactful. Commanders who had previously endured frustrating setbacks now possessed reliable weaponry. The USS Tang, under the command of Richard O'Kane, recorded remarkable achievements. Similarly, the USS Barb, equipped with modified firing pins from the USS Holland, commenced an illustrious combat history. American submarines patrolled critical sea routes around Japan, including the Philippine Sea, East China Sea, and South China Sea. They destroyed tankers, freighters, troopships, and warships alike. The flow of raw materials to Japan from occupied territories came to a halt, crippling its economy. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, food from Indochina, all had to travel by sea, and American submarines with operational torpedoes dominated these waters. By 1945, Japan was in dire straits. Through their relentless efforts, American submarines accomplished what strategic bombing and surface naval engagements could not. They severed the lifeblood of Japan's war machine. Utilizing a weapon that eventually proved to be highly effective once it functioned properly, these submarines played a pivotal role in bringing about the end of the conflict. The Mark I torpedo remained in service until 1980. Over several decades, it underwent numerous upgrades and enhancements. However, its transformation into an effective weapon would never have been possible without Charles Lockwood's relentless investigation, which was considered impossible at the time. An admiral who refused to tolerate defective weaponry, a covert inquiry conducted despite explicit orders to the contrary, and one crucial test that confirmed what everyone already suspected: the torpedoes were malfunctioning. It took a decision to rectify these issues irrespective of regulations, bureaucracy, or potential risks. Charles Lockwood passed away on June 6, 1967, at the age of 76. He is interred at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California, alongside Admirals Chester Nimitz, Raymond Spruance, and Richmond Kelly Turner, heroes of the Pacific War who turned defeat into victory. Lockwood's greatest triumph did not come from combat, but rather through his indefatigable investigation at Frenchman Bay, rigorous testing at Kuwait. His legacy was further cemented during every patrol briefing where he listened intently to submarine commanders and made decisions that prioritized the trust and well-being of his people over bureaucratic constraints. His enduring lesson is that leadership requires the courage to defy established norms when lives are at stake. It entails undertaking investigations deemed impossible, addressing issues others claim do not exist, trusting one's team members more than rigid protocols dictate, and refusing to send anyone into battle armed with faulty equipment. This was Charles Lockwood's improbable inquiry, and it illustrates how one admiral managed to rectify America's faulty torpedoes.